What's up, everybody? Happy Sunday. Welcome into the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. Our first Sunday without football since back in August or September. I hope you're hanging in there. We've got one game left, of course, Chiefs Buccaneers. Looking forward to that game. However, after that, it is a long time until football again, but we will get through it together 365 days a year here on the Pack a Day podcast. And of course, it always makes the offseason go a little bit quicker. And I know it's not the offseason quite yet, but makes it go a little bit quicker when we've got fun and interesting trades to talk about. And certainly that's what happened on Saturday. The trade can't exactly take place up until the first league day of the year. So the trade is not technically completed as of yet, but reportedly Matthew Stafford is going to the LA Rams for a third round pick this year, a first round pick next year, a first round pick the following year, and of course, Jared Goff. So let's take a look at this trade from a few different angles. Let's start with the LA Rams. I like this trade for the Rams. I don't love it. I do think it makes them better in the interim. I think they're trying to open up a 2 to 3 year window with Matthew Stafford. And in doing so, you're giving yourself an opportunity with Matthew Stafford, Aaron Donald, and of course, Jalen Ramsey. And that entire Rams defense, their offensive line's really good. You got Cam Akers on a cheap deal still. You've got Cooper Kupp. Sean McVay, still a very, very darn good head coach. So you're trying to open up a window for the next 2 to 3 years and seeing if you can't get a Super Bowl, honestly, for probably Aaron Donald, Matthew Stafford, and Jalen Ramsey as they kind of continue on in their careers, and seeing if you can't get a ring for those guys. But and Andrew Whitworth being another, older veteran there as well. But this is a risky approach for the Rams. You're giving up 2 future first round picks, a current third, and that is a ton of first round picks that they will be without. They won't be having a first round pick again since 2024, and they haven't had one since Jared Goff. So that is a ton of time without a first round pick, which means that you have to be really good on the margins. You have to be really good 2nd through 7th rounds and making sure that you are finding value selections, undrafted free agents. We know the salary cap is going down. You're paying a butt ton of money to Aaron Donald and Jalen Ramsey. Now Matthew Stafford's in the fold. You're paying some dead money to Jared Goff. So this isn't going to be easy for the Rams, but I can understand the thinking. You're in no man's land with Jared Goff. You're in, we've seen it happen with the Bears with Mitch Trubisky, great defense, Mitch at quarterback, Allen Robinson at wide receiver. They had some weapons. Mitch Trubisky at quarterback. It doesn't work. Same thing with Jared Goff. We saw them get up until the promised land, but they couldn't win it, in major part because of Jared Goff. He just wasn't going to win you the big game. And Green Bay just experienced that, right? They just had a game against the Rams that's a tough game, made much easier by the fact that Jared Goff was at quarterback. So this gives the Rams a puncher's chance to get over that hump, maybe into another Super Bowl, maybe even win one. I like the move for the Rams. I don't love it. I certainly understand what they're trying to go for, though. The Detroit Lions, interesting trade. And I think the tough thing here is the player that you're trading, Matthew Stafford, makes the Rams a better football team. The Rams are just coming off a playoff performance. The 21st pick in this year's draft is what they would have had if they had their selection, which they don't. But, so now you're making them better. It's tough to imagine that either of these picks in the next couple of years is anything better than like the 25th pick in the draft. And you're taking on Jared Goff, which is basically like a 1 year, maybe 2 year, placeholder while you kind of develop a quarterback, which isn't the worst thing in the world. You get a 3rd round pick this year. So you're getting 3 top 100 picks out of this. But, to take on Jared Goff, the 3rd round pick and taking on Jared Goff might cancel each other out in and of itself. And then you're not even getting a top 20 selection period, potentially, for Matthew Stafford. You do get a couple lottery tickets, and maybe the Rams finish 4th in a really tough division in one of those years. Maybe Stafford gets hurt or declines, and maybe you can pick up a little bit better of a draft choice. But you're not even guaranteed a top 25 pick out of Matthew Stafford. And if I'm a Lions fan, I'm a little bit perturbed by that. Like, I think I could legitimately get a top 25 pick. And, if I'm dealing Matt Stafford, and they couldn't get that. And maybe it ends up being that. But for the time being, you got to kind of go into this thinking that those are going to be, pick 25 to 32, somewhere in that range, because the Rams probably should be pretty good over the course of the next couple seasons. So I don't hate it for the Lions. I certainly get it. It's a long-term approach. They get a placeholder at quarterback. Maybe they take a first-round selection at quarterback this year. Make no mistake, taking Jared Goff in that trade should not alter their plans of selecting a quarterback in the draft in any way, shape, or form. It's insanely tough to imagine that Jared Goff is going to go from the friendly confines of Sean McVay's offense into an entirely new system and get better. I don't think that's going to be the case, and he already wasn't very good. So that's just a placeholder. Somebody in the meantime while they develop a quarterback, which again is a smart move, but they have to get a quarterback sooner rather than later and start developing that pick. So it's okay for the Lions. I would have liked them to get something a little bit more immediate, something that they can start, biting their teeth into. If they could get a, top 20 pick this year along with their pick, maybe they can move up in the draft a little bit, get one of those premium quarterbacks. So instead, they're going to have to maybe take a little bit more of a long-term approach, which for the Lions maybe isn't the worst thing, but you also got to wonder if they can actually pay off having a couple extra first-round selections. Drafting has not exactly been their forte over the years. Now, from a Packers standpoint, well, adding Jared Goff to the division certainly doesn't hurt things. As I mentioned on Twitter, hopefully the Bears can re-sign Mitch Trubisky to a really prime deal so that you can end up with Kirk Cousins, Mitch Trubisky, and Jared Goff as your quarterbacks. Who knows what happens in Chicago? Just keep Deshaun Watson out of that spot. Other than that, I think it should be okay. But it's going to be a really interesting offseason. I think it certainly helps you in the division. Going from Matthew Stafford to Jared Goff in the interim certainly makes that an easier division to win when you've got Aaron Rodgers at quarterback. And I think that's a good thing, but it also makes the Rams a tougher out. Now, you're going to face tough teams in the playoffs no matter what. So, you kind of expect that, but it definitely makes one of the top teams in the NFC better, and you don't necessarily like to see that either. So I think it's kind of a wash for Green Bay. You have a tougher team in the conference, but a worse team in your division, but also a team in the division that's got some extra ammo to kind of build up a team for the future. So this is all going to be interesting to see how it plays out. I think for Green Bay, it ends up mostly being a neutral type of deal. Again, I can understand it for both teams. Don't love it for either. Like it a bit more for the Rams than I did for the Lions. All right, so I also wanted to go over one other thing. I posted on Twitter today. I was interested to see kind of the snap counts and how Brian Gutekunst draft classes have kind of worked out. And I kind of was looking at this because when I talk with Ben Fennell on the audio version, he kind of always brings up, not always, but he's brought up, how many snap counts, some of these younger players, we talked about one time, does Green Bay have a draft and develop problem? Are they getting their immediate return on investments on some of these draft picks like other teams are getting? And this draft class in particular obviously was a draft for the future, which Green Bay tends to do, but they didn't get a ton of return on investment in this year's season. So I wanted to look, we've got 3 Brian Gutekunst draft classes in. How many of these picks that he's had, and he's had 28 selections over the last 3 years, how many of those selections played at least half the snaps on offense or defense? So if you're an offensive player, did you play half of the offensive snaps? If you're a defensive player, did you play half of the defensive snaps? And only 4 players played half of the offense or defensive snaps. And that was Jair Alexander, Darnell Savage, Elton Jenkins, and Marquez Valdes-Scantling. Now, it's a pretty good group of 4, right? I don't think anyone's arguing that Jair, Savage, Jenkins, or MVS aren't good players, but you've had 28 selections in 3 years, and only 4 of those players made it to 50% or more of their snaps either on offense or defense. Now, there's a lot that goes into this, and I know when I tweet things, understanding that people need to have nuance is maybe foolhardy on my end, but I'm making an observation. That's all I was doing. It's interesting to me that only 4 players in the last 3 drafts played over 50% of the Packers snaps this year. So, of course, the nerd that I am, I wanted to go back and see, all right, how did that compare to the other 32 teams in the NFL over the course of the last 3 seasons? So the Packers, 4 out of 28, which is 14.29%. So the first thing I did, what about the 2 Super Bowl teams? Well, Kansas City, they only had 2 out of 18 of their draft picks that played 50% or more. It was Nick Allegretti and Juan Thornhill. So 11.11% of their draft picks over the last 3 years played 50% or more. So I'm like, all right, certainly not an indicator one way or the other. If the best team in football arguably hasn't done a whole lot with their draft, maybe it's just that, these are veteran teams that don't need to play their players a lot. How about Tampa Bay? Well, Tampa Bay had 8 of their 23 selections who played 50% or more of their snaps for 34.8% of their draft class that, again, has played 50% or more. That also does not include Vita Vea or Ronald Jones, who almost assuredly would have hit that 50% mark had they been healthy this year. But all of these teams, I didn't take injuries into consideration, so I can't take it into consideration for them. So 8 out of 23 for Tampa Bay this year. Still, it's a really high percentage and some really important draft picks, including Tristan Wirfs and Antoine Winfield Jr. just this season. So who had the most? Well, the two most teams were the Chicago Bears and the Atlanta Falcons. They had 7 of their draft picks over the last 3 years, and they each only had 19 selections. So 7 out of 19 for 36.84%. Certainly a much higher rate than the 14% for the Packers. So what does it mean? And let me say this as well. The average throughout the course of the league was 24.76%. So the average was about 5.75, almost 6 draft picks over the last 3 years, playing 50% or more out of an average of 23 selections over that time frame. So 5.75 out of 23.2 for a 24.76% average. That was the average around the league. Green Bay was 10% below that. They were the second worst team to the Chiefs in the NFL. There were 2 other teams that were at the exact same percentage as Green Bay. So they were tied for second in the NFL with the lowest percentage of players of their draft classes over the last 3 years that played 50% of the snaps or more. So what does that mean? Honestly, it doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot quite yet. It's an observation, and I wanted to make it. It's interesting to me. It's what I do. I nerd out on some of these things, and I like to see, where the Packers stand in comparison to other teams. There's a lot that goes into this, right? If you're a bad football team, sometimes you're getting your younger players on the field to see what they can do in those type of situations. It's not necessarily that they're good. It's not necessarily that they're bad. You just want to see some of your young players and see if they can hang and do better. Again, if in the number one team that really struggled with this was the Chiefs, and they won the Super Bowl last year, and they're probably, or at least a favorite to win the Super Bowl this year. So it doesn't necessarily mean a lot. Some of these playoff teams are going to play their younger players less because they're veteran teams, very similar to what Green Bay is. They've got a lot of talent. So I think that's the first thing that you have to look at. It doesn't necessarily mean it's apples to apples. You also have to look at the fact that the Packers generally are picking a little bit later in the draft. And certainly that was the case this last year. Not the case in 2017 or 2018. Rashawn Gary, Jair Alexander, certainly early picks. Darnell Savage was a first. Elton Jenkins was a top 50 selection. So they've certainly had, some earlier picks, but all teams are created differently. Some teams have more picks, some teams have less. Some teams have really high picks, some teams have later picks. So your success with it doesn't mean a whole lot. Also, you could have a group of 4 or 5 draft picks that played 50% or more, but they're not good players. Whereas Green Bay has Savage, Jenkins, Jair Alexander, some really, really good players to show for it, including Jair and Jenkins, who are, Pro Bowl or All-Pro caliber players, or at least near there. So again, I'm not making a huge commentary on this other than to say it's an interesting statistic and one that's going to be worth keeping an eye on over the course of the next few seasons to see how these last few draft classes really come along for Brian Gutekunst. And if you look at it this way, 2018, we basically know at this point, there's not much left. Jair Alexander and Marquez Valdes-Scantling are going to be the 2 players that probably make or break that draft class. Maybe Josh Jackson has a breakout in year 4. I'm telling you, I'm not seeing it, but there's just not much left. J.K. Scott, Hunter Bradley have not exactly been great specialists. EQ hasn't turned out so far. Jamon Moore certainly didn't turn out. Cole Madison didn't turn out. Even some of the later picks, Kendall Donnerson. So it basically is coming down to Jair and MVS out of 2018. In 2019, it's looking like Rashawn Gary, Elton Jenkins, and Darnell Savage are going to be really good picks. And in 2020, we don't know anything yet. We think A.J. Dillon might be a pretty darn good player, but we don't know much of anything from the 2020 class. So you get Jair, MVS, Gary, Savage, and Jenkins. Those are kind of your 5, I don't want to say sure things, because I don't think MVS is there yet. I'm not even sure, Gary or Savage are to that level yet, but, you've got 5 players that you like so far out of those 3 classes. And then you have your wild cards, whether it's Jordan Love, Josiah DeGuara, A.J. Dillon, Kamal Martin, John Runyon Jr., Jay Sternberger, Kingsley Keke. Those are your guys that will ultimately decide just how good these draft classes are. And Green Bay needs those guys I just mentioned, Love, DeGuara, Dillon, Martin, Runyon, Sternberger, and Kiki, to take a jump over the course of the next couple years to make sure that this train keeps running, that they're developing these players at a high pace. If not, that's certainly going to make things a lot tougher for Green Bay, and those 3 draft classes will end up looking a lot worse. Ultimately, end of point here, there's a lot to be decided. This recent draft, we don't know much yet. It's a lot of incomplete grades. The previous draft, a lot of promise, still some incompletes. It's going to take time to play out. 2018, we've got a pretty good idea. Jair Alexander, MBS. Don't think we're going to get much more out of that, but it'll, again, be worth keeping an eye on. All right. I know it was maybe much ado about nothing, but I hope you enjoyed that little breakdown of Ted Thompson. Brian Gutekunst's last 3 draft classes. I got Ted Thompson on the brain lately. Rest in peace, Ted. We miss you. But thank you so much for following along. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. If you have not checked out the audio version of the Pack a Day podcast yet today, I actually had the opportunity to interview Mike Tannenbaum, the former general manager of the New York Jets. Had the opportunity to talk about some of this stuff, Brian Gutekunst drafts, his trade for Brett Favre, those sort of things. So make sure to check that out. That's going to do it for me today. Until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.